Welcome back to Citizen One, Exploring Our Urban Future. I'm your host, Douglas Stewart McDaniel, and this is my Christmas Eve podcast. Christmas Eve is one of the few moments left in the year when the calendar still does what it was meant to do. It gathers people into a shared pause. It marks an ending without demanding resolution. Tonight felt like the right moment to talk about time itself, not abstractly, not academically, but as something many of us have quietly lost our grip on over the last decade. So I'd like to put you briefly into my Wayback Machine, as I like to call it. As some of you may recall, people remember 2016 as a particularly bad year, as if it announced itself. It didn't. It arrived quietly and then began rapidly taking things away with unsettling regularity. At first, it felt like coincidence, a loss here, another there, famous names, familiar voices, cultural anchors that had always seemed oddly permanent. The first one came early, only 10 days into the new year. Within hours of David Bowie's death, the phrase appeared everywhere, almost embarrassed by its own bluntness. 2016 is already canceled. It was posted half as a joke and half as a warning and carried the energy of superstition rather than grief. People shared it because it felt safer to name the year than to name each loss. Something about Bowie's death made time itself feel implicated. The reaction wasn't disbelief, it was suspicion. Ziggy Stardust was just gone, as if the calendar itself was the suspect, and the reaction surprised even the people feeling it. His death carried an unspoken implication that reinvention itself had limits. He had survived every version of the future we could imagine. When he didn't survive this one, the mood started to shift. Prince then followed in April, and the shock hardened into something much colder. The internet stopped pretending it was a coincidence. The tone shifted from gallows humor to accusation. Posts appeared asking what the year wanted from us. Others demanded to know who was next, phrased less as speculation and more as resignation. A widely shared tweet read, "I don't trust this year. I don't trust it at all." It wasn't clever. That was the point. It sounded like something said under the breath while watching a door that wouldn't stop opening. It was no long farewell, no graceful descent. Prince vanished inside the machinery of modern life, his memory processed by systems that felt so indifferent to genius. It became harder to believe that brilliance offered protection. It became easier to believe that the world no longer slowed down for anything. The losses kept coming, not in waves, but in a steady cadence that left no room to recover. Alan Rickman's death felt like the disappearance of restraint itself, the quiet authority of a gentle someone who never raised his voice because he never had to. By summer, the phrase started to stabilize. 2016 is the worst year ever. Sounds pretty quaint now, so many years and so many catastrophes later. It showed up on late night monologues, Tumblr dashboards, Facebook status updates, Reddit threads, and news chyrons that pretended to be ironic while clearly enjoying the relief of consensus. It became shorthand for a shared exhaustion that hadn't yet found its root cause. People weren't arguing with the statement, they were adding evidence and more evidence. Each death, each attack, each political rupture arrived already framed as confirmation. The year had become the villain. Gene Wilder followed, and with him went a particular strain of gentleness that once made absurdity and whimsy feel safe. When Wilder died, the response was quieter and more unsettled. The jokes stopped landing. And then Leonard Cohen's death arrived with a feeling of a deliberate punctuation mark. Someone posted, 2016 isn't just killing people, it's waiting until they say goodbye first. The comments circulated not because it was clever, but because it felt explanatory. The year was no longer just chaotic, it was becoming purposefully mean. That belief made the losses easier to metabolize in some respects. If the year had intent, then grief at least had some kind of context. People wrote about their childhoods, about kindness, about a tone of humor that felt unexportable to the present condition. One comment, shared thousands of times, read, "This feels like the last thread from a better version of us mentally snapping." No one pushed back. There was no debate. It felt accurate in a way facts rarely do. And then on Christmas Day, George Michael died, and the year stopped pretending it had any sense of taste or timing. Without irony, it felt like a last shared Christmas, one of the final moments when grief still arrived collectively, with holiday music attached and familiar songs. Carrie Fisher's death 2 days later landed differently. She had survived too much to be considered fragile. She had turned science fiction, survival, and addiction into a public service, using grace and humor as armor and honesty as currency. When she died, it felt like resilience itself had been forgotten. One widely shared line said, if she couldn't make it through the year, what the hell chance do the rest of us? It wasn't despair, it was a recalibration of meaning. When her mother, the incomparable Debbie Reynolds, followed her only 1 day later, the year abandoned subtlety entirely. We were pissed. And 2016 ended the way it had behaved all along by refusing to space out the emotional damage. None of this happened in isolation. In 2016, politics unraveled in parallel. Brexit demonstrated that history could be reversed by popular vote, which shook a belief that progress, once achieved, was durable. The American election fractured the idea that disagreement required even shared basic facts. Public discourse stopped moving forward and began circling itself. Violence appeared everywhere and nowhere at once, flattening individual tragedies into a continuous feed that never paused long enough to register with us. It was no longer just the worst year ever. It became the year that broke reality. Memes compared 2016 to a corrupted save file. Headlines used the language of malfunction. Commentators spoke openly about living in an alternate timeline, often half joking, often not. The idea that history could fork overnight stopped sounding implausible. People began saying, can't be real, without irony. By the time the atrocities of Aleppo disappeared from the news cycle that year, something essential had shifted. A city could be erased in plain sight, documented exhaustively, and then set aside. Attention moved on, just like in Gaza today. Time doesn't linger, and it's not the sense of scale or loss. It was not body counts or catastrophe metrics that distinguish it. What made 2016 unbearable was the sensation that the year itself had stopped absorbing impact. Events no longer landed inside a story. They stacked, they accumulated without processing. Grief became ambient rather than acute. As the year closed, lists proliferated and we all became numb. Not best of lists, not retrospectives, tallies. How many icons 2016 took? What else have we lost? Please, God, let this year end. In hindsight, that is why a year like 2016 feels strangely nostalgic now. It was the last time loss started to arrive with such punctuation marks. People mourned together then. News stopped long enough to register what had happened. The calendar still felt like a shared object, something communal rather than mechanical. And on December 31st, the most shared sentiment was not celebration, it was relief. People wrote about surviving the year the way one writes about surviving a fire or cancer. There was no sense of victory, only escape. Midnight promised an escape hatch, but it wasn't. After 2016, global structure dissolved even further. Events stopped lining up in a way that felt remotely survivable. Nothing resolved cleanly anymore. Crises accumulated without release. Consequences lagged behind actions, sometimes by years, sometimes indefinitely. Time continued to advance, but meaning began slipping its gears. Such breaks in time itself became impossible to ignore by March 2020. When the world shut down, time lost its edge. Days flattened into one another. Weeks collapsed inward. Months passed without landmarks. People lived inside the same rooms while the calendar advanced without reference to experience. The phrase COVID time entered our shared language because nothing else could hold the disorientation. Lockdowns eventually lifted, but time didn't seem to return. It accelerated. Years compressed. Memory began filling entire seasons as if they had happened off screen. People spoke about 2021 and 2022 and 23 and 24 the way one speaks about dreams, with certainty that something occurred and uncertainty about where it fit into the whole scheme of things. The world resumed motion without recovering our rhythm. Work followed the same pattern. Careers evaporated under the language of efficiency. Automation and AI did not arrive as spectacle or rupture. They arrived as subtraction and extraction. Roles disappeared quietly and sometimes loudly. Skills aged overnight. People were not dismissed so much as bypassed. Entire professions were reassigned to systems that did not require consent or explanation. By the middle of this decade, millions of us are still standing where March 2020 had left us. The world had moved forward without synchronization. Time had become selective. It accelerated for institutions, platforms, politicians, and capital, while stalling for bodies, households, families, and local lives. Some trajectories advanced rapidly, indexed by updates and releases and patches and quarterly gains. Others just looped. Days repeated, weeks reset, familiar patterns. The calendar continued advancing even when nothing else seemed to. By late 2025, another phrase has begun circulating, first as a joke and now without so much humor. People say they feel like NPCs. And they do not mean this metaphorically. They mean it in a specific way gamers mean it. Background figures, non-essential characters who exist to populate a system rather than influence it. Someone would mention Skyrim, half smiling and half exhausted. The shopkeeper who repeats the same line every day. The guard who delivers a canned response no matter what chaos unfolds around him. The character frozen in place while the real decisions happen elsewhere. The comparison resonates because it maps so well. Since March 2020, millions have followed prescribed paths, but no longer with any sense of agency. Work has disappeared while calendars advance. Skills have been deprecated without notice. People show up, log in, complete routines, and wait for dialogue options that never seem to unlock. The world keeps leveling up around us. AI systems optimize logistics, finance, media, and labor with breathtaking efficiency. Updates roll out weekly, if not daily. Human participation becomes optional. Many were not fired. They were simply no longer called. Time accelerates for those still inside the machinery and stalls for those pushed out of it. People exist inside the system, but the system no longer acknowledges them as players. And this is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. Language shifts again in response. Simulation theory stops sounding playful or philosophical. It stops functioning as provocation and begins operating as clinical diagnosis. Not because people believe the world is fake, but because reality behaves like a system under load. Effects lag behind causes. Accountability arrives too late or not at all. Present feels buffered, padded, as if something essential has been abstracted away just to keep the machinery running and forgetting about our humanity. In moments like this, people have always looked backward as much as forward. Ancient calendars resurface in conversations these days, not as superstition, but as orientation. Lunar cycles, solar years, older ways of reckoning time that once tied duration to ritual, season, and consequence. Calendars have always been tools for making time livable. They space grief. They mark endings. They tell people when something is over. That struggle is ancient. The Book of Enoch has been reappearing in conversations these days, in the margins of some discussions. Not for the angels or the visions, but for its obsession with time. The Book of Enoch warns that when rulers alter the year, disorder follows, not because the heavens changed, but because human reckoning did. The sky keeps its courses. People broke the calendar. Now in December 2025, attention turns again toward the heavens. An interstellar object designated 3I Atlas passes through public consciousness. Astronomers are calm about it. There's no threat. The trajectory is looking pretty stable. The calculations close. The object is behaving exactly as expected, which makes it somehow worse because public reaction escalates anyway. People watch the sky the way humans always have when time feels unreliable. Live streams multiply, amateur charts circulate, old zodiac frameworks resurface, new ones are invented overnight. The fixation is not driven by fear of impact, it's driven by the unease of precision without meaning. At the same moment, people began arguing about years again and calendars. 2025 was labeled the year of the snake, associated with shedding, deception, and recursive collapse. 2026 is framed as the year of the horse, associated with acceleration, momentum, riderless flight without restraint. These designations are not evaluated for their accuracy. They're either accepted or rejected based on whether they feel structurally useful, more to our spiritual sides than to our intellect. People are not trying to predict the future, however. They're trying to locate themselves inside time again. Looking back, 2016 now appears almost orderly. Loss arrived one recognizable name at a time. Grief had edges. Mourning was shared. The year absorbed impact, and time still felt like something inhabited collectively. Everything that followed blurred. The calendar continued advancing, but it no longer helped people make sense of what was happening right in front of their eyes. It stopped spacing loss. It stopped marking endings. It became a conveyor of acceleration rather than a container of memory. The year 2025, however, does not destroy hope entirely. It does, however, remove the assumption that time itself will help carry us to what comes next. Because now there's this realization that is clarified into something undeniable. The sky still keeps its course with indifferent precision. The seasons still turn, the clocks still advance. None of that has failed. But we are the ones who no longer know where we are inside the year or inside the calendar. For a long time, it has felt as though we are living inside someone else's system, governed by calendars we did not design and schedules that no longer recognize us. Times arrive pre-formatted, optimized for throughput rather than experience, advancing whether or not our lives have room to move or evolve with it. We mark days because the system requires it, not because the days are giving us anything back. That sense of temporal displacement has done real damage. It has convinced people that agency belongs elsewhere, that meaning has been abstracted upward into platforms, feeds, algorithms, and institutional timelines that can no longer be appealed to. It trains us to experience our own lives as background activity inside someone else's machine that continues running with or without us. But calendars have always been human inventions. They were never neutral instruments. They were created to make time inhabitable, to space that loss, to allow for that return, and to insist that beginnings and endings still matter. When calendars failed in the past, people did not abandon time. They rebuilt it together. So another trip into the Wayback Machine. The French Revolution understood this instinctively. When the old order collapsed, the revolutionaries did not limit themselves to overthrowing the kings and the churches. They rewrote the calendar. They renamed the months. They restructured the week. They attempted to reset time itself, beginning history again from year one. It was an explicit admission that power does not only reside in law or force, but in how a society organizes its days. That experiment failed badly, and it failed quickly. Not because it lacked logic, but because it stripped time of shared habit faster than people could replace it with meaning. Farmers ignored the new weeks, markets drifted back to familiar rhythms. Even revolutionaries continued using the old dates in private. The calendar collapsed because it forgot its purpose. It treated time as something to be administered rather than inhabited. What the French Revolution revealed unintentionally was the limit of imposed time. You can abolish a monarchy by decree. You can erase a church from public life. You cannot make people live inside a calendar that does not recognize their bodies, their grief, their relationships, or their need for return, their need for story. When time stops feeling human, it stops working. There have been other moments like this before. In the late 20th century, when institutional authority felt hollow and time itself seemed misaligned with human experience, figures like Timothy Leary gave voice to a radical response. Tune in, turn on, drop out was not an invitation to apathy. It was an attempt to reclaim consciousness from systems that felt dishonest, coercive, and spiritually bankrupt. It assumed there was still an outside, a place to step into where meaning could regenerate on its own. That assumption no longer holds. There is no margin left to retreat into, no untouched elsewhere where time resets automatically. We live fully inside these many systems we once imagined escaping, and the sky will not intervene. The stars will not slow. Time will continue doing what it has always done with indifferent precision, offering no reassurance and no verdict. What remains within reach now is more modest, more difficult, and ultimately more human. Reclaiming agency no longer means dropping out. It means stepping back in with greater intention. It means restoring shared markers of meaning inside our years. It means choosing moments that matter and honoring them publicly. It means insisting on pauses that cannot be optimized away, on gatherings that are not entirely mediated, and on endings that are acknowledged rather than overwritten by the next update. It means refusing to live exclusively inside someone else's calendar, someone else's machine, someone else's definition of progress. That is not withdrawal. That is re-entry. It is the work of rebuilding civitas in a world that has mistaken efficiency for belonging. Calendars were never neutral instruments. They were designed to make time inhabitable, to space lost, to allow for return, to insist that beginnings and endings matter because we agree that they do. When earlier generations tried to dissolve those structures, they learned how fragile meaning could become. When we outsourced them to systems optimized for throughput, we learned the same lesson from the opposite direction. The responsibility for meaning has always been ours. The task ahead is not to outrun time and not to predict it and not to optimize it. The task is to inhabit it again together, deliberately and imperfectly, as participants rather than background characters, as citizens of shared days rather than occupants of someone else's schedule. That is how years regain their shape. That is how 2026 begins. Thank you for joining me this year on the Citizen One podcast. As this year closes, I don't think we're facing an ending so much as a reckoning, not with technology, not with the sky, not even with history, with time itself. Calendars were never meant to optimize us. They were meant to hold us, to space loss, to make return possible, and to remind us that beginnings and endings mattered because we agreed that they did. Somewhere along the way, we let those structures be replaced by systems that measure throughput instead of meaning. Time may keep moving, but fewer of us feel included inside it. If this episode has a point, it's not prediction or warning, it's invitation. 2026 doesn't need to be faster. It doesn't need to be smarter or more AI driven. It doesn't need another narrative imposed from above. It needs shared pauses and breaths, chosen moments together, gatherings that aren't optimized away, and endings that are acknowledged instead of overwritten by the next update. That work doesn't belong to platforms or algorithms or institutions. It belongs to each of us together. The sky will keep its course. It always has. It will offer no reassurance and no verdict. Meaning was never waiting for us out there. It has always been something we build together, inside the year, inside the calendar, one moment at a time. This is Citizen One. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel. Wherever you are tonight and this weekend, thank you for sharing this pause with me, and I'll see you in 2026.